Bennett Ashcroft had not expected anyone to knock on his door that night, least of all a stranger soaked to the bone, shivering under the porch light of a farmhouse that had belonged to his father for 40 years. Before it belonged to him. The storm had rolled in fast, the way storms did in that part of the country, turning the gravel road into a river and the sky into something violent and low. He had been sitting alone in the kitchen, the way he had sat alone every night since his father's funeral, 3 months earlier, when the knock came, soft at first, then desperate. He opened the door and found a woman he had never seen before. Her name, he would learn, was Marlo Winters, and she stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, her hair plastered to her face, her shoes gone, one strap of her dress torn at the shoulder. She did not ask to come in. She asked in a voice that cracked in the middle if she could just stand under the porch roof until the rain let up. Bennett had grown up being told not to trust strangers, especially ones who appeared out of storms with torn clothes and no explanation. But there was something in the way she flinched when the thunder cracked, something in the way her eyes kept darting back toward the road, that told him this was not a woman looking for trouble. This was a woman running from it. He stepped back and told her to come inside. She hesitated so long he thought she might refuse. Then she crossed the threshold like she was crossing into a country she didn't trust yet, and he closed the door behind her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The house was quiet except for the rain hammering the tin roof, a sound his father used to say was the only lullaby a farmhouse needed. He gave her a towel, and one of his father's old flannel shirts because it was the driest thing he owned, and he put the kettle on without asking if she wanted tea, because it seemed like the kind of night that required tea whether anyone admitted to wanting it or not. She sat at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world, and slowly in pieces she told him where she had come from. She had been driving for 6 hours. She did not say from where, not at first, and Bennett did not push. She said only that she had left in the middle of an argument that had turned into something more than an argument, that she had grabbed her keys and her purse and nothing else, and that somewhere around the state line her car had died on the shoulder of a road, with no lights and no houses, and she had walked in the rain until she saw his porch light glowing through the trees like something out of a story she used to believe in as a child. Bennett did not ask what the argument had been about. He didn't need to. He had seen the way her hand trembled around the mug, the way she kept glancing toward the window like she expected headlights to appear. He recognized fear when he saw it, because he had spent the last 3 months learning what grief looked like in a mirror, and fear and grief were cousins in the way they hollowed a person out from the inside. Instead, he told her about his father. He told her about the farmhouse, about the wheat fields that hadn't been planted this season because he hadn't had the heart to do it alone, about the silence that had moved into every room of the house since the funeral like an unwelcome tenant who refused to leave. He told her things he hadn't told anyone, not his sister, not his co-workers, not the few friends who had stopped calling because grief made people uncomfortable, and eventually they always stopped calling. Marlo listened. She didn't try to fix it or rush him past it the way people sometimes did. She just listened, and somewhere in the listening, something in Bennett's chest loosened for the first time in months. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that her mother had died the year before, and that in some way the argument that had sent her running into a storm tonight was the last unraveling thread of a life she had been trying to hold together ever since. She said grief made people do strange things, stay in relationships they should have left, forgive things that shouldn't be forgiven, run in the middle of the night with no plan and no destination. Just the desperate need to be somewhere that wasn't there anymore. Bennett understood that more than she knew. They talked until the storm passed, and then they talked past that, into the hours when the rain became a drizzle and then a memory. When the kitchen window began to show the faintest gray edge of morning, he learned that she had been a school teacher once. Before things got complicated, that she still dreamed sometimes about a classroom full of children who weren't hers but felt like they were. She learned that he had been trying to decide whether to sell the farm or plant it one more season, that some part of him was afraid that letting the land go fallow was its own kind of giving up. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, she fell asleep at the kitchen table, her head resting on her folded arms, and Bennett sat across from her for a long while, watching the way the porch light caught the side of her face, thinking about how strange it was that grief had led them both, from entirely different directions, into the same quiet kitchen on the same violent night. He carried a blanket from the hall closet and draped it over her shoulders without waking her, and then he sat in his father's old chair by the window and watched the sun come up over the fields that hadn't been planted, and for the first time in 3 months, the silence in the house didn't feel like something he had to survive. It felt like something he was sharing. When Marlo woke, the storm was long gone and the sky outside was the pale gold of early morning. She looked disoriented for a moment, the way people do when they wake somewhere unfamiliar. And then she remembered, and something like embarrassment crossed her face. Embarrassment at having shown up soaked and broken on a stranger's porch, at having fallen asleep at his table, at having let herself be seen so completely by someone she'd known for less than a night. Bennett told her there was nothing to be embarrassed about. He made breakfast. Simple things, eggs and toast, and they ate mostly in silence. But it was a comfortable silence now, not the heavy kind that had followed him through every meal since his father died. She told him she needed to figure out what came next, her car, a place to stay, a plan that didn't involve running. He offered to drive her into town, to help her sort out the car, and she accepted. And as they stood on the porch before leaving, she turned to him and said that she didn't know what would have happened to her if his porch light hadn't been on that night, if he had looked at a stranger in the rain and decided not to open the door. Bennett said that his father used to tell him the measure of a man wasn't what he did when things were easy. It was what he did when a stranger showed up needing something he couldn't ask for out loud. He said he thought about that a lot since the funeral, and that maybe some part of him had left that porch light burning every night, not because he was waiting for anyone, but because some part of him needed to believe that kindness was still a thing people did for each other. In the dark, they exchanged numbers before she left, not with the certainty of two people who knew what they meant to each other, but with the quiet hope of two people who had been strangers 12 hours earlier and now weren't quite sure how to be strangers again. Weeks later, Bennett planted the wheat field after all. He said later that it was the only season he ever felt was worth planting for reasons he couldn't fully explain, except that a woman who had walked out of a storm and into his kitchen had reminded him that things could still grow, even after everything felt like it had gone quiet and cold and unplantable. Marlo found her own footing too, a new town, a new classroom, a life she was building, on her own terms instead of running from someone else's. But she kept in touch with Bennett, first with hesitant texts, then with longer calls, then eventually with visits back to the farmhouse where a porch light still burned every night, not because he was waiting for a stranger, but because he had learned that sometimes the light you leave on for someone else is the same light that finds its way back to you. Neither of them ever called it fate, and neither of them ever tried to explain why two broken people found each other on the worst night of one of their lives. But Bennett liked to say that his father had been right about one thing. The measure of a person isn't what they do when it's easy. It's whether they open the door when someone is standing in the rain with nowhere else to go.